There is a version of an empath that most people online never talk about because it does not fit the fragile, easily victimized stereotype we have all been fed for years. This version does not get destroyed by a narcissist. This version quietly, systematically, and without ever raising their voice ends up being the one thing a narcissist genuinely cannot survive contact with. Today, we are talking about the super empath and the 5 specific things they do that a narcissist has absolutely no defense against. Let us be clear about something before we start because it matters. Most empaths in the early stages of dealing with a narcissist get hurt badly, deeply, and sometimes for years. The stereotype of the empath as an easy target is not wrong. It is just incomplete because it only describes one stage of a much longer arc. What almost nobody discusses is what happens on the other side of that arc when an empath survives enough cycles of manipulation to finally understand the mechanics of what is actually happening to them. Because once an empath crosses that threshold, once perception turns into strategy and compassion turns into boundary compassion, they become something a narcissist has never encountered before and has absolutely no functional response to. Here is the first thing a super empath does, and it is the foundation everything else is built on. They stop trying to be understood and start simply observing. This sounds like a small shift, almost too subtle to matter, but it changes the entire dynamic of the relationship at a structural level. Most people caught in a cycle with a narcissist spend enormous amounts of energy trying to be understood, explaining their feelings more clearly, providing more context, and hoping that if they just find the right words, the narcissist will finally see the impact of their behavior and change. This need to be understood is completely natural, and it is also exactly the leverage a narcissist uses to keep someone endlessly engaged, because understanding can always be dangled just out of reach forever, as long as the other person keeps believing it is coming. A super empath does something different, and it happens quietly, almost invisibly from the outside. They stop needing the narcissist to understand anything at all. Instead, they start watching genuinely, carefully, and almost clinically at the patterns. Not with hatred, not even necessarily with anger anymore, just with the calm, detached curiosity of someone studying weather patterns rather than trying to reason with the storm. They notice that this is the specific sequence that happens before an argument starts. This is the exact phrase used right before a guilt trip. This is the precise moment their tone shifts from charming to cutting. And once you are observing a pattern, instead of pleading with the person, something remarkable happens. You stop being surprised by anything. And a person who is no longer surprised is a person a narcissist can no longer destabilize, because destabilization depends entirely on catching someone off guard. This shift from "please understand me" to "I understand you completely" is, ironically, one of the most devastating things that can happen to a narcissist's control over a relationship, because it flips the entire power dynamic without a single confrontation ever needing to happen. The second thing a super empath does is that they become completely unreadable in the exact moments a narcissist expects a reaction. This is worth sitting with because it is counterintuitive. Most people assume the way to handle provocation is to either respond calmly and rationally or to avoid the confrontation altogether. A super empath does neither. They simply do not perform the expected emotional sequence at all. And this absence, this refusal to supply the predictable reaction, is far more disorienting to a narcissist than any argument could ever be. Remember that a narcissist's entire relational strategy depends on being able to predict and provoke your emotional state. They know which comment makes you defensive. They know which silence makes you anxious. They know exactly how long to withhold affection before you start chasing it. This predictive model is the entire engine of their control. A super empath, having studied the pattern extensively, as we talked about in point 1, starts deliberately declining to supply the expected reaction. The insult that used to trigger a defensive explanation now gets met with mild, almost amused silence. The guilt trip that used to produce anxious over-apologizing now gets met with a simple, flat acknowledgement and nothing more. The silent treatment that used to produce frantic pursuit now gets met with the super empath simply living their life unaffected, exactly as if nothing unusual is happening. This unreadability is not coldness, and it is not suppression. A super empath still feels things fully, often more intensely than most people, because their emotional perception was never actually the problem. What has changed is that they no longer broadcast every internal reaction outward for the narcissist to read and use. They have learned to feel privately and respond deliberately. And that gap between what they feel and what they show is exactly the space a narcissist predictive model can no longer penetrate. And a narcissist without a working predictive model of you is functionally disarmed, even if they do not consciously understand why. The third thing a super empath does, and this one tends to genuinely infuriate a narcissist more than almost anything else, is that they refuse to compete for the narrative. Narcissists almost universally run on narrative control. They need to be the hero, or at minimum, the victim, and never simply one flawed person among several in a shared, complicated situation. When conflict arises, their instinct is immediate and automatic. Control the story, reframe what happened, cast themselves as reasonable and you as unreasonable, regardless of what the facts actually were. Most people, understandably, fight back against this, trying to correct the record, trying to make sure the truth wins, gathering evidence, recruiting witnesses, and replaying the actual sequence of events to anyone who will listen. A super empath does something that looks from the outside almost like giving up, but is actually one of the most powerful moves available in this entire dynamic. They let the narcissist have the narrative publicly, while quietly keeping their own internal record completely intact. They do not need to win the argument about what happened in front of family, in front of mutual friends, or in front of anyone, because they have already done the deeper work of knowing exactly what happened, holding that knowledge with total confidence without requiring anyone else's agreement to validate it. This means a narcissist's favorite weapons of narrative control, reputation management, and painting themselves as the reasonable one simply stop working the way they used to. Not because the super empath fought back against it, but because they stopped needing to win a battle that was never actually about truth in the first place. This absence of narrative competition is disorienting for a narcissist in a very specific way, because their entire self-concept depends on the story being contested, on there being a battle to win. When someone simply refuses to fight for the story at all, the narcissist is left holding a narrative nobody is actually resisting. And there is something strangely hollow and unsatisfying about winning an argument no one else is trying to win. It is like pulling as hard as you can on a rope that is no longer attached to anything on the other end. The fourth thing a super empath does is that they give warmth selectively, deliberately, and never automatically. This is maybe the most important shift of all, because it is the one that finally breaks the specific mechanism narcissists rely on most heavily, which is the assumption of unconditional access. In the early stages of any relationship with a narcissist, empaths who are by nature deeply generous, deeply forgiving, and deeply willing to extend grace offer warmth constantly, automatically, and almost reflexively, regardless of how they were treated the day or hour before. This is exactly what makes empaths such attractive targets in the first place. Their warmth is not conditional on good treatment, which means a narcissist can behave badly and still receive the exact same level of affection and effort afterward with no real cost. A super empath restructures this completely. Warmth becomes something earned through actual behavior in real time, rather than something given automatically because of history, hope, or emotional habit. This does not mean becoming cold or punishing. A super empath is not playing games and is not withholding affection strategically to manipulate the other person back into compliance. It is simpler and more honest than that. They have just stopped performing warmth. They do not actually feel in a given moment. If someone was cruel an hour ago, the super empath does not force a smile and act as though nothing happened, the way they might have years earlier, out of a need to keep the peace. They simply reflect accurately where things actually stand. This is devastating to a narcissist in a way that is hard to overstate, because narcissists have almost never had to actually earn ongoing warmth from the people close to them. It was always simply available, a background constant they could rely on regardless of their behavior. The moment that constant becomes conditional, a narcissist is confronted, often for the first time in the relationship, with an accurate mirror of how their behavior is actually landing. And because their sense of self depends heavily on being liked, admired, or at minimum engaged with, the sudden absence of automatic warmth often produces exactly the kind of anxious, off-balance behavior we have talked about in other episodes. The sudden charm offensive, the unexpected vulnerability, and the increased effort all arrive, ironically, only once the free, unconditional supply finally runs out. The fifth thing a super empath does, and this is the one that ties everything else together into something a narcissist genuinely cannot recover from, is that they quietly close the door permanently without making an announcement or leaving a single opening for negotiation. They build a life so full and self-sourced that the narcissist becomes irrelevant to it rather than central to it. This is the ultimate destination of everything else we have talked about today, and it is worth understanding why it matters so much more than any single tactic or boundary. Narcissists thrive on being the emotional center of gravity in someone else's life. The person whose mood determines everyone else's mood, whose approval feels necessary, and whose presence or absence dictates the emotional temperature of an entire household, friend group, or family system. A super empath final and most complete evolution is the quiet, patient construction of an internal and external life that simply does not orbit around that person anymore. Friendships that have nothing to do with them. Interests and goals that were never about proving anything to them. An internal sense of worth that was built brick by brick, entirely independent of their opinion. Once this life exists, once the super empath well-being genuinely does not hinge on the narcissist's behavior, mood, or approval, something happens that a narcissist has no strategy for at all. They simply stop being able to generate any meaningful reaction, no matter what they try, because there is no longer a centralized emotional dependency to pull on. The old tactics of guilt, charm, rage, the silent treatment, and narrative control were all designed to work on a person whose emotional world revolved around the narcissist's approval. Once that is no longer true, every single one of those tactics starts landing on someone who has somewhere else to be, something else to think about, and a life that was never actually waiting for the narcissist's permission to be full. This is, in the truest sense, how a super empath destroys a narcissist. Not through confrontation, not through revenge, and not even through leaving dramatically, but through simply becoming a person the narcissist's entire toolkit was never built to handle. Calm, observant, unreadable on command, indifferent to narrative wars, conditional with warmth, and utterly and completely whole without them. In the next part, I want to walk you through what this actually looks like day to day, the specific internal discipline it takes to sustain all 5 of these simultaneously, especially in relationships you cannot simply walk away from, and why, once a narcissist realizes what they are actually dealing with, their behavior often takes one of 2 very different and very predictable turns. Let us talk about what happens once a narcissist actually realizes what they are dealing with, because it almost always goes one of 2 ways, and understanding both in advance will save you from a lot of confusion and self-doubt when it happens. The first path is escalation. This is the more common response, especially early on, because a narcissist instinct, when a familiar tactic stops working, is rarely to try something new and healthy. It is to intensify the old tactic on the assumption that it simply has not been applied with enough force yet. If guilt used to work and suddenly does not land the way it used to, the narcissist does not usually conclude that maybe guilt is not the right approach anymore. They conclude that they need to guilt them harder. If charm stopped generating the eager, grateful response it used to, they escalate the charm, sometimes into something that looks almost desperate. Grand gestures, sudden vulnerability, and promises of change arrive suspiciously only once the super empath has stopped chasing. This escalation phase is one of the most important moments in the entire dynamic, because it is exactly when people are most likely to second-guess themselves. The narcissist, sensing the old supply drying up, will often produce their most convincing performance yet. Genuine seeming tears, an uncharacteristically self-aware apology, and a level of attentiveness that feels for a moment like real change finally arriving. This is precisely the moment a super empath discipline gets tested most severely, because everything in their nature, including the deep compassion, the genuine hope for people to heal, and the desire to believe the best about someone they once loved, pulls hard toward giving this one more chance. Here is the internal tool that gets a super empath through this specific moment. And it is simpler than it sounds. They have learned to evaluate change over time and not over performance. A single convincing moment, however emotionally compelling, is data from one data point. Real change shows up